right, so here is the beginning of chapter 4, which is on cellular functional anatomy. You should have learned a lot about eukaryotic cells in AMP1, and in our class, we're going to focus on the other type of cell, which is prokaryotic cells. Now, it's very possible that in AMP1, you didn't really learn these two terms, or maybe you just got introduced to them very briefly, because in AMP1, you really only talk about eukaryotic cells. And depending on, how much your instructor wanted to get into this in AMP1, they may not have mentioned that there's actually two different types of cells, prokaryotic cells and eukaryotic cells. That's because prokaryotic cells are only bacteria. And of course, in our class, bacteria is our main focus. Whereas in AMP, you really are only talking about the different cells that make up the human body, which are eukaryotic cells. But eukaryotic cells are actually what make up everything on Earth besides bacteria. So plants, animals, humans, as well as algae, fungus, other things that we talked about in chapter 1, they're all made up of eukaryotic cells. So as you can see from this slide, there are many differences between prokaryotic cells and eukaryotic cells. So you definitely want to know this information. This will be really important for the first exam. So prokaryotic cells, they are much smaller. They are less complex. The DNA is not enclosed in its own membrane, so they do not have a nucleus. In prokaryotic cells, it is called a nucleoid, which is just a region of DNA, not an actual organized, enclosed nucleus. Bacteria do not have organelles. They all contain a very important cell wall. They divide in a process called binary fission. Eukaryotic cells divide in a process called mitosis, which you definitely should have learned about in AMP1. So, like I said, you just want to know the differences between prokaryotic cells and eukaryotic cells. There are quite a lot of them. And just remember that the term prokaryote can basically be used interchangeably with the term bacteria. So bacteria are unicellular organisms because they are single-celled. So they're just made up of one single cell. And like I said, they are smaller and more simple than a eukaryotic cell, but they do have a fairly complex outer structure, which we're going to talk about. Mostly, we're going to talk about the cell wall. Now, some bacteria have what's called a capsule, which can give them special abilities or special properties, which we'll talk about a little bit more. And then you should have talked about the cell membrane, which is the same thing as the plasma membrane in AMP1, which the cell membrane of bacteria is extremely similar, almost identical to the cell membrane of eukaryotic cells. And then cilia and flagella are also very similar in prokaryotic and eukaryotic cells. We'll talk a little bit more about flagella in particular. And like I said, the DNA region of a bacterial cell is called the nucleoid. So not the nucleus, but the nucleoid. And bacteria cells do contain ribosomes. Ribosomes in prokaryotic cells have the same function that they have in eukaryotic cells, which is to make protein. So this is actually, it's a couple different pictures in your book. So if you look in chapter 4 of your textbook, you will see these pictures. Now, you're not going to be tested on these pictures per se, but you will definitely need to know these shapes because bacterial shapes and arrangements are super important in our course. They're important in lecture and in lab. They're very important to identifying bacteria, knowing what type of bacteria is causing a certain type of infection. And it's really crucial to understand these terms. So in chapter 1, I gave you the terms cocci, bacilli, and spirilli. So cocci is spherical shaped, bacilli is rod shaped, and spirilli is spiral shaped. So now we're building on those three basic shapes and giving you even more shapes and arrangements that you need to know. So diplococci means two cocci that are together. Streptococci is cocci that's in chains. And a tetrad is when four of them are together in essentially a group. And then when you have two tetrads together, that's called sarcinae. Now, probably the one that you've all heard of the most is staphylococci. Staphylo means when they're grouped up in clusters. So I always say that staphylococci looks like kind of like a grapes, like a bunch of grapes. That's what I always think of when I see staphylococci. So again, you don't need to know the pictures. You just need to know the terms. So just basically treat these as vocabulary words, know which one is two, which one is four, which one is chains, which one is clusters, and you should be in good shape there. So then with bacilli, which is rod-shaped, streptobacilli is bacilli that are in chains, and then coccobacilli is kind of like a combination of cocci and bacilli. So just, kind of like somewhere in between. It's not quite spherical and it's not quite rod-shaped. Then over with sporulli, we're going to talk about a specific kind of bacteria that, Vibrio causes a specific disease that we're going to talk about later in the semester. But for now, you just have to know that Vibrio basically looks like a comma-shaped kind of thing. Sporillum is kind of like a little kind of curly or like a corkscrew kind of shape. And then spirochete kind of looks like a little worm. So again, don't need to know the pictures, treat them as vocabulary words, know which types are which types, and you should be in good shape for the shapes.